This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
I could while away the hours, conferring with the flowers, consulting with the rain. And my head I'd be scratching while my thoughts were busy hatching if I only had a brain. I'd unravel every riddle for any individual in trouble or in pain.
With the thoughts you'd be thinking you could be another Lincoln if you only had a brain.
How's that for random nostalgia? We started a series a few weeks ago. If you've not been with us, we started a series a few weeks ago called Mind, Heart, and Soul. And my understanding of what we're doing here, and it's helpful if I understand it because I'm the one that's got us into this mess, but is that our jumping off point is really a confession coupled with what, in my estimation and many others, is maybe the most brilliant thing Jesus ever said. The confession is simply this, that we often find ourselves facing things in life for which we lack the adequate strength. Like we find ourselves faced with circumstances, oftentimes things outside of our control, and the overwhelming reality of what we feel in our guts is we don't have what it takes to do this. And yet it's something that often isn't expressed. It's something we often don't tell people. It's just something we feel. And then at other times, we find ourselves in circumstances where we have opportunities. I was thinking to myself this morning, like risk is one of those things that like we all love the idea of risk when it comes to business, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to new opportunities. In theory, they're awesome, but they're terrifying when you're actually faced with like the day that you move, the day that you get on the airplane, the day that you change jobs. And so what we're exploring is like where do we get the internal strength, the guts, I don't know what word you use for it, the internal fortitude to make the decisions that are incredibly difficult to make. And the brilliant statement of Jesus that I think couples with this is, when he was asked, like, simplify it for me. What does it mean to follow you? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your mind and all your heart and all your soul. And other places he added strength. And what we've been wondering in this series is, what if Jesus was before his time? What if he understood that an individual is made up of these distinct parts? That there's these several things that go into compiling his personhood. And what if a person who understands what it means to have a mind and understands what it means to have a heart and understands what it means to have a soul and is further healthy in those areas, what if they're much stronger than they would otherwise be? That's kind of what we've been working on. And so 2 weeks ago, we started talking about what does it mean to be healthy in our minds? What does it mean to be strong in our minds? And the first idea we talked about was this idea of thinking simply. That in my estimation, what we did there was we took some brilliant modern science coupled with the wisdom of the text and went, hey, sometimes when you're faced with difficulties, sometimes when you feel weak, thinking is actually counterproductive. And probably for a group of people that make up a room like this who are prone to be very cerebral, like that in itself is incredibly counterintuitive. That sometimes when we have problems, we can think so much that we actually cloud our thinking. I got an email this week from a new friend who I think was more than anything affirming what we were talking about, and what he was sharing was that several months ago he found himself in a situation where he was invited and yet had to hold the responsibility of doing the memorial service of a young guy that he'd never met. And you could imagine the tension, the pressure that comes with like, what am I going to say? Not affirming things that maybe you don't know, at the same time being kind and gracious. And he said that he'd wrestled with that for hours, as much time as he had to wrestle with what he would say at that gathering. And then it was 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up and just boom, he had it. These 3 or 4 very clear points, like here's what I need to say. And I suspect that some of you have experienced similar things. Later, he said he was in a similar situation where he was presented with this new leadership opportunity, and he'd spent days and weeks wrestling with what would be the strategy that he would, if he were given this position, what would be his strategy. And again, after much study, things got messier and messier in his head, and he was more and more frustrated. And again, it was in the morning when he woke up where he had these very clear directions, like, okay, it'll be this and this and this, and this will be my priority. That's kind of what we talk about when it comes to thinking simply, that when we find ourselves in these difficult situations, sometimes like pulling back, and as James said, if you need wisdom, ask God. Like that in of itself is a source of wisdom. This morning, what I want to talk about is this idea of thinking expectantly, which is, I think, a lot trickier. I think we have a lot more mental and emotional aversion to this idea. It's easy to confuse it with self-help and, kind of vain positive thinking. But as I was thinking about it on Friday, because I really had to wrestle with this week in my own personal journey, what occurred to me is, you've heard me talk before about how this anxiety is something that I've wrestled with my whole life. I didn't realize it until several years ago. I didn't have that title on it. And it occurred to me that the way I think about a situation and the way my wife does, they're entirely different. Like me being the anxious person, I could be 2,000 miles away from the mountain, but I can imagine myself there, and then I can imagine myself lost there, and before I know it, I'm freaking out in my head because I'm lost and going to die on the mountain, right? Or the car wreck or the phone call that nobody wants to receive, those types of things, and my brain locks up on the really bad things and the helplessness that comes with that. My wife, maybe it's because she's got medical training, maybe it's DNA, she does the opposite. She instantly begins to think about how she would get herself out of that mess. So I'm going duh, it's foggy on Whitefish Mountain and I'm gonna get lost, I'm gonna die. And she's thinking, well, if I get lost, then how am I gonna find my way out? It's kind of, I think, what I want us to think about this morning. Or you could think of it like this. There's a guy, Bill Dallas, who today is a popular author and communicator, but years ago in the 90s, he was an investment he was a personal investor, or still didn't get my statement right. He was a part of a group that had millions of dollars who invested in commercial property. They would leverage millions, they would buy commercial property, they would flip the commercial property, they would make more millions. There were lots of people during that part of the economy doing this, right? Well, at one point, he made a decision that he didn't give a lot of thought, but he made the decision to borrow some money from that pool of millions and to do his own side deal. And he bought this commercial piece of real estate, and his thinking was he would flip it on his own, he would quickly repay back the pool of money, and everything would be fine. Instead, what happened was the bottom fell out of the market. And his partners began to ask, where's this missing millions? And without much investigation, they realized that the missing millions had been lost by one of their partners. And they turned the case over to the DA, and he was rather quickly convicted of, if I recall correctly, it was called grand theft embezzlement. He was sentenced to multiple years in San Quentin prison, not exactly a white-collar prison. And as he tells the story, in the initial days of his sentence, when they would give him an hour to be out in the open courtyard, he would oftentimes, over months, he would just curl up in a ball. He said he was completely and utterly hopeless. The conversation that he remembers having the most in that first year of his sentence involved asking other established prison mates how one kills themselves while they're in prison. And then one day, after more than a year into his multi-year sentence, he was climbing the several stories on the cell block. And I can't remember if it was the third or the fourth story, and he got to this place where though he had made this very same ascent, almost every day for over a year, for the first time he literally lifted his eyes and he saw beyond the walls. He literally, for the first time in his stay there, saw life beyond the prison walls. And in that moment, what started as a very physical reality became an incredible emotional, spiritual metaphor for him. And for the first time, he began to imagine life beyond the walls. He began to imagine what God might be doing in him inside those walls. He began to imagine what he could learn from this. And today, he literally says he wouldn't trade his time in prison for all the money in the world. It's the idea of seeing walls that I think all of us can relate to. Right? Like you've been there. Whether that was a marriage that was clearly about to end, a physical diagnosis that just felt like a gigantic wall, a business that was changing, a business that was failing, a job that was going away, whether it was the decision of a child that they had made that formed a new reality for them and you. I think we can all relate to the idea of just being surrounded by walls. And that's really the idea here, is that we find ourselves surrounded by walls, and the overwhelming thought is, Lord, I don't have the strength to move forward in this. So this expectancy thing really asks the question, what is the power of expectations? What are the power of expectations? Speaking of that, I was in Billings last Friday for a wedding rehearsal, and then on Saturday that was the wedding. It was like every wedding person's worst nightmare because it was 30 degrees in Billings, and it was a 7 o'clock at night wedding in October. It was an outdoor wedding. And then we got in the car and drove home and got home at a little after midnight. My friend Lenny told me last week, this isn't a political comment, but he told me that from the platform I looked like Obama in the lecture or in the debate. So if you noticed that I was dead last week, that was why. But I heard a story while I was there that does have some redemptive value. My aunt and uncle, who my dad's sister, they're in their 50s, they'd recently went to Hawaii. And upon landing in Hawaii and getting their rental car, and they couldn't check into their motel yet, so they decided they were going to head straight to the beach. Well, it was then that my aunt realized that she forgot sunscreen. And as my uncle stopped, I don't know whether it was like to get gas or what it was, but apparently he had stopped somewhere, and she's like, hey, grab me some sunscreen. And he came out to the car without any sunscreen, and she's like, where's the sunscreen? And he said, it was $9. And she's like, we're in Hawaii, I need sunscreen. And so they had those conversations that married people have, and eventually he agreed, I'm sure, to stop by Walgreens or whatever it was they decided to stop, and together they went inside to get some sunscreen, among other things. When she got out of the car, though, she said they each had a set of keys with the little clicker on it, and when she got out of the car, she had her swim bag on her lap, and she said she thought to herself, I should maybe put it in the trunk or under the seat, and she's a hushka, and so she's extrapolating the worst possible scenario as well, and for whatever reason, she just decided to put it back on the seat of the car. And so she locked the door, and they walked inside, and they bought their sunscreen and other things, and they came walking out, and as they got to the car, she was there first, and she grabbed a little clicker thing, and she unclicked the doors, and she opened her door, and just as she had expected, the bag was gone. And she had this little moment, right? And then my uncle, he opened the passenger door on the driver's side, and his backpack gone. And so now they each have their little moment, right? Like the worst nightmare on vacation, and they're having this panic thing, and then they're clicking buttons. And I think I told the story wrong last service, or at least my wife said I did, because apparently eventually she was clicking the buttons, and she clicked the trunk button, and the trunk on the car next to them opened. And so it too was black, but it actually was an Impala. And so she ran over to the passenger side door, opened the door, and boom, there's her bag. He is, by that point, is to the passenger door on the driver's side. There's his backpack. And then they had this very conflicting emotion, right? Because they're happy, but then they realize they just rummaged through the car of a complete stranger. So they run over and they close the doors and they get in their car, and I'm sure they're apologizing to each other as they're driving off to the beach, and they got several blocks away, and my aunt said, hey, so where's the sunscreen? And he said, I reckon it's on the driver's seat of that stranger's car. Expectations. I'm told that the first doctor to really delve into this subject of the power of expectations was a guy by the name of Dr. Rosenthal. He was a professor emeritus at Harvard, and one of the first studies he did involved, he took a bunch of teachers and a bunch of their respective students, and he arbitrarily labeled some of those students intellectual bloomers. So follow me there, took a bunch of teachers, took a bunch of their students, and just kind of arbitrarily highlighted, like, I'm going to call this kid an intellectual bloomer and this girl an intellectual bloomer. And then one by one, he pulled these teachers aside and began to highlight for them these kids that were in their classroom that were extraordinarily brilliant and talented, and just did everything he could to raise the expectations that the teacher had for this particular or these particular students. And by now you may suspect what happened by the end of the school year. That what's not so groundbreaking now was when Dr. Rosenthal was first delving into this topic, that what they found was that by the end of the school year, those students, because it was completely bogus, there was actually no science to the labels that he was applying, those students that had been given those labels to the teachers did remarkably well, far exceeded the other students in the class. And that began getting even cognitive scientists to begin thinking about this idea of expectations. Years later, they did a similar study, but they flipped it. This time they took students and arbitrarily labeled their respective teachers either incredibly gifted or incredibly lame. And so some students walked into a classroom thinking that they had one of the best teachers in the state, and other students walked into the class thinking they had one of the worst, most boring, most unkind teachers in the state. And at the end of the school year, they looked at test scores. And as you might imagine, those students who were told their teachers were awesome had incredible test scores. And even good students who were told that their teacher was lame found their teacher to be incredibly unkind and undelightful, and their scores reflected their lack of enthusiasm about their teacher. Like, what is the power of expectations? I know that this quickly gets us into like godless self-help, but what are the power of your expectations? Particularly when you see a wall, you get the diagnosis, you get the pink slip, you find out about the affair, you find out about the terrible thing. I mean, you fill in the blank. What is the power? What is the benefit to at that point stretching your thinking? What is the power at that point of thinking well about the future? One story that I'm assured is a true story, Dr. Parrott tells this story. It involves a man some decades ago when people would travel across the country on trains, like, boxcars. I don't know what they call them these days. I don't even know it's legal anymore, but these guys would jump on top of boxcars and they'd ride trains across the country. I don't know why I'm struggling to say that because I grew up in Laurel, but I'm guessing that whatever term that I used then isn't politically correct. So you with me? Okay. So one man climbed onto what he thought was a boxcar. He was in the yard itself, and it wasn't long after he got into the boxcar that the train was switched, and therefore the car was switched, and therefore the door was jostled, and it was slammed shut, and he found himself locked in. And it was then that he realized he wasn't in a boxcar, he was in a refrigerator car. Now, what we know is that he panicked. He freaked out, and the reason we know that he freaked out is because he started carving a message in the floorboards of that train car. We know that he panicked because of what he said, and we know that his panic cost him his life because he did die. He was found the next morning by the refrigerator repairman. Turns out the boxcar hadn't been working in days. And this gentleman had come to fix this broken car. So was it cold? Yes. Was it cold enough to die in? Yeah, theoretically. But medical examiners confirmed, no, he could have survived this. Like, what are the power of your expectations when faced with walls? You got rubber bands? Everybody should have 2 rubber bands. If you didn't get a rubber band, I've got extras. I'd love to get you rubber bands. I've even got a rubber band gun. Anybody need an extra rubber band? We've got a good insurance policy. We will pay for your missing eyeball. So, because we're all children, I'm going to first give you a task, because I know you want to shoot a rubber band. Give a man a rubber band or a woman, and they need to shoot it. How's this for freaky? It's a part of this freaky set. So go ahead, see if you can hit the nice woman's head. Hey. I forgot to tell you to save one. Because the next thing I was going to have you do is flick the person next to you, like you're in elementary school again. So if you still have one, go ahead and snap the person next to you. Anybody need one to snap their neighbor? I heard this, what I thought was brilliant metaphor for the rubber band today, last week, and I thought, I wonder who invented the rubber band. And so we have the benefit of Wikipedia and Google, and so I got on and found out that the rubber band was indeed invented in 1845 by a British inventor. You might imagine that go ahead, wow, John, nice work. Oh, look at you, that's like the performance-enhancing drug of rubber bands, look at that. So then I thought, well, what is this Perry individual who invented the rubber band, what does he look like? And I just thought that you too might like to be amused by well, here you go. We've got it. I don't know why I found that so funny, but hey, I invented the rubber band, so I now pose with my shirt off. I mean, I don't understand. Though it does follow that the man who invented rubber bands is a man of incredible physique. I don't know. We can get that creepy picture off there, and I'm told that last service that I needed to get rid of this because several people told me they didn't hear another word I said. I'm indebted to John Maxwell for this one, but think of this, like a rubber band, its usefulness is tied directly to its ability to be stretched. Would you agree? Like, that's what makes it useful. Think of an instance where you've used a rubber band where it didn't require that it be stretched, and, well, I'll bet you can't. I mean, that's yarn. It's not a rubber band. What if central to what it means to use our minds the way God called us to use our minds involves embracing those stretching moments, if you will? What if thinking expectantly means not only seeing walls, it means not only seeing windows in walls, but it means embracing those times when our stretching is when our thinking is being stretched, and recognizing that that's actually when our mind is at its best. Like, we know this, right? Like the greatest inventions, some of the most artistic thought, it's always the result of challenges, unprecedented challenges. What if to think expectantly isn't just to be positive for positive sake, but it's to keep yourself thinking forward? See, I think the real issue is there's lots of reasons why we have aversions for doing this, like false hope. I mean, if you're someone that's been around the church for a while, then chances are you've found yourself in relationships, or maybe you yourself have done this, where people are offering these religious platitudes that were really more offensive than they were helpful, and you don't want anything to do with that. Like, you don't want to explain away difficult situations with such neat, clean words. Maybe you're very new to Jesus and even considering Jesus, and maybe sitting in a church is something that's rather foreign to you. That's probably why, because you hear people in your office and that you work with, they offer these weird explanations that try to put a spin on things that they're brutal. Maybe you're like me, like you at all costs want to avoid sounding like a Hallmark card. Like you don't want to be that person. You don't want to get a long ways down a road and find out that your hope was completely false. You don't want to be, and we've been there personally. We've watched friends be there. The endless list of New Year's resolutions. I read this week that 40% of people make New Year's resolutions, and it's almost 40% of people make the same New Year's resolutions every year. Like we've been there. Troubling diagnoses. You probably know someone who was beat up spiritually in the midst of what was a terminal diagnosis. Dead-end relationships where abused people keep saying things like, oh, they've changed this time. Even dreams and goals and ambitions for which we lack the competencies. And I think closely related to this idea of false hope is just frank discouragement. The word discouragement actually comes from the French language. It goes back to the age of monarchs, when a king or a queen would encourage or disencourage. That doesn't make any sense. What's the word I'm looking for? Discourage, where he would encourage, or she would encourage or discourage a person. Hi, my name's Adam, and I graduated 6th grade. It involved appointing to an office or being disappointed from an office. None of us wants that. Life is hard enough to set ourselves up for moments where we're just going to be discouraged anyway, disappointed anyway. Which I think is really the most honest way we can go here. Like, isn't the reality that like thinking optimistically, thinking in these terms, thinking expectantly, it leaves you vulnerable. It leaves you vulnerable to discouragement. It leaves you vulnerable to disappointment. It's risky. And I don't know what else can be said about it. In fact, Thomas Merton, one of my favorite Catholic monks, not that I'm a big student of Catholic monks, but this guy is remarkable. He said it this way. He said, to hope is to risk frustration. Therefore, make up your mind to risk frustration. There's an honesty there, isn't there? And I have to wonder, getting to the text, I mean, an honest scholar will tell you we don't really know who wrote Hebrews, but it strikes me that if you go to Hebrews and you read chapter 11, which if you've not done so, you should, it'd make a great week of just quiet times. It's clear that this individual has spent considerable time contemplating guys like Abraham and Isaac and just the men and women of incredible faith. And he summarizes their lives by saying this: now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That is what the ancients were commended for. That's what they embraced. That's the risk they took. And he goes on to say this in verse 6, and without faith, it's impossible to please God. Which to me seems to imply that this whole idea of thinking expectantly, you have a hard time pleasing God if you're not willing to do that. I mean, what science calls expectancy, it sure does seem a lot like what we call faith, doesn't it? And no one's suggesting that it should be blind faith. No one's suggesting that we should just pick things and believe in them. But at some point, is expectancy required. And after much contemplation, did the author of Hebrews understand this? Like, hey, here's what it boils down to. Embrace risk. Embrace the risk of frustration. You know, John the Baptist is but one character in the text, I think, who demonstrates that people in the text, they not only took the risk, but sometimes they were on the wrong side of the risk. John the Baptist, of course, is this remarkable friend of Jesus and key player in the New Testament. And early on in his ministry, he finds himself arrested and in prison and facing probable death. And he sends his disciples to Jesus. I'm just going to pick up in Matthew 11. It says, after Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went from there to teach and preach in the towns of the Galilee. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Now, it would take some time in a commentary to kind of unearth this, but what's going on here is Jesus is saying, I am precisely who John thinks I am. I am the Messiah. I am the promised one that Israel has been waiting for. But his last sentence is what? Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Parenthetically, John, I am God, and you're going to die in prison. I am everything you hope I am. I am everyone who you hope that I am. And yet that's not going to save your life. I think if we're honest, the people in the text, they risked the very same frustrations, the very same, they walked into the vulnerabilities that we have this aversion for. Because John the Baptist went, okay, so Jesus, are you the one? And Jesus says, yep. And yet you're still going to die. Think of Abraham. I mean, how much does it change the lives of the people of faith if they don't embrace this type of mental discipline? Abraham's told at the very beginning of his story and really God's redemptive story in Genesis 12, the people said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's house, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. But if you know the story of Abraham, you know that it turns out that land that he's promising, he'll never set foot in it. Not only that, it turns out that the land that God is promising him and his people, it's not just barren land. It tends to be occupied. And it tends to be occupied by people who also like the land, and they're not just going to give it up easily. And not only that, the whole promise is that his heirs will be so numerous, and yet it turns out that his wife is incapable of having children. How much different is Abraham's story if he's not willing to embrace God's call to expectancy? To see the walls, but to see windows in the walls. To see the uncomfortable nature of what he's being faced with, but to understand that God does great things in the midst of his stretching circumstances. And you just run the list. I mean, run it through Hebrews. Joseph, one of the most remarkable characters in the Bible. If you think that the Bible's boring, it's a great place to start. Genesis 37. This incredible character. Why? Because he's given these remarkable promises by God. And then the next thing that happens is he's betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery into Egypt. And then he becomes the best worker that employer ever had. But then the worker repays it by having him thrown in jail on a false accusation. And it's one thing after another. And yet what makes Joseph's story so remarkable is that the whole time you don't have any sense that he's lost hope. Did Joseph understand what we're suggesting, that God is a God who calls us to think with expectancy? Caleb and Joshua, the spies, the two who were willing to imagine what was completely impossible, the defeating of these foreign countries. Moses at the burning bush. I mean, if Moses wasn't willing to embrace this type of thinking, does he ever leave the burning bush? No way. Cognitive psychologists tell us that understanding something about the future gives us power. One of the classic studies on this involved a study where they took a group of people. They gave this group of people each individually a list of items that they wanted to be purchased inside this grocery store. And then the additional challenge was to purchase as many of those items as they possibly could and to find the best deal that they possibly could. They then separated the group in two, if you will, and half of the group was told, it's brutal in there. It is busy. I mean, it is like Walmart on steroids. It is not going to be an enjoyable experience. The other group was not told that. Guess what? Their experiences were entirely different. Those who were in fact told it'll be brutal, it's not going to be fun, it's going to be discouraging, like you're going to hate it, they got way more items right on the list. They purchased way more items, they found the best deal, and their general attitude was like, yeah, it was busy, but that's all right. Why? Because they knew what to expect. Those who didn't know what to expect, their attitude was terrible coming out. They purchased very few items, and they got very few best deals, if you will. There's power to knowing what's coming. And yet, I think what Jesus tells us pales in comparison, what they knew pales in comparison to what Jesus tells us. In John 16, facing his imminent death, Jesus says something very straightforward, very true, very succinct. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, I will overcome the world. I've told you this so that you can live with peace. You can know what's coming, and here's what's coming. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be disappointing. It's going to be frustrating. Is Jesus saying, hey, risk frustration? Like, risk it. Be vulnerable. Think expectantly. It seems to just drip from his life, doesn't it? It seems to be what he values and what he celebrates. I was thinking, just as a closing thought here, of my favorite verse for years, or maybe that's such a lame way to say it. Like, I suppose the truth claim of Jesus that I cling to the tightest is in John 10:10 when he says, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Like, it's the thief that comes to steal and kill and destroy. I come that you may have life. And what I love about that verse is it moves us beyond, it's just a very practical verse. Like, Jesus' claim is, like, test me. See if I'm not the very best way to live. See if my way, my ethos, my yoke isn't the very best yoke. Dallas Willard, I think, says it best when he was asked by a student one time, why do you follow Jesus? And his reply, well, who else do you have in mind? Like, I just love the truth of that. I was thinking this week, in light of what we're talking about here, that it's a brilliant statement of Jesus. I think it might also be his most brave statement. Because to claim that you're God, I mean, okay, that takes some courage, of course. To claim that you're going to rise from the dead, that takes some courage. But if you've ever given someone counsel, you can appreciate how vulnerable that makes you. If you've ever given someone advice, you can appreciate how vulnerable that makes you. If you've ever said to someone, and in many cases maybe you haven't because it is so risky, hey, just do it the way I do it because it'll work. That's gutsy. That leaves you incredibly vulnerable. And I don't know that I could have appreciated this until the journey that I've been on over the last few years of getting the privilege of standing on this stage and having this responsibility of cracking open the Word and making observations and asking questions and, in some sense, giving advice. And it is such a terrifying thought sometimes when you see your advice letting people down, not working for them. It gave me this whole new appreciation for what Jesus is saying here. Like, hey guys, I have the guts not just to say that I'm God, not just to say that, like, if you believe in me, you'll have eternal life, like forever kind of eternal life. But like, my way is the best way. That is bold. That is courageous. I guess what I'm posing is this thought: what if Jesus is saying that, like, the best way to think, one of the best ways to use your mind, particularly when faced with a wall, is to think expectantly? And I would argue that we see it all over the Gospels. The centurion who comes to him and says, hey, could you heal my servant or child? I can't even remember what the details were. And he's like, yeah, let's go. And he's like, no, you don't need to go. Just say the word. Time and time again, he's affirming people who think in faith. So my challenge to you, I don't know what the wall is. I don't know if the wall is a venture. I don't know if the wall is a risk that you get to embrace, or if it's a challenge that you're forced to embrace. But what if life works best when you see through the wall, when you see windows in the wall, when you embrace the fact that being stretched is not necessarily a bad thing, though it leaves you incredibly vulnerable? What if a life of faith is one like John the Baptist, where you move forward with expectancy, knowing that sometimes God will prove far too mysterious and your hopes will be let down, and yet he still sits on his throne? Let me pray and give you a chance to worship a little more through music. God, this is like so many things, one of those topics that exists on a continuum and it can be abused in either direction. And God, we even have conversations about, are you pessimistic or are you optimistic? And we tend to categorize ourselves that way. But it sure seems, Lord, that like you gave us what we needed to know. Life would be hard. Bad things will happen. Bad things will even happen to great people with great intentions and great organizations with great intentions. But that the life that you pull us to is one where we think with expectancy. Would you help this to land in real, honest ways in our own lives, God? We love you. Amen.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.